joining me now. To beg your pardon, before that, we have been talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the stories making the headlines today. The Ukrainian president commenting on Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov's comments about the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler being Jewish. It was supposed to be a comment to suggest that this was the reason why Russia was in Ukraine, to denazify the country. But back to the energy summit in the European Union, where leaders have been quite in disagreement about, the payment of Russian gas in ruble. I have joining me now Orisha-Jemi Obomine, who's the head of research at Augusto & Co. He is joining me virtually. Thank you for joining me on the program this morning. A pleasure having you.
Morning. How are you?
I'm good. And you? Enjoying the holiday?
Yes, I am.
That's if you have the time to. So let's talk, business now. And, this issue with the Russia gas is quite important, isn't it? It was the only thing that was left out, of all the sanctions imposed on Russia, of all, the agreements, to push Russia into a box. This was the only area that was not touched. So why is it even becoming even more sensitive now, especially for other European countries, knowing that Russia could really have threatened them, with cutting off gas supply to their countries because of the sanctions imposed?
Okay, so now remember that the sanctions were supposed to be economic sanctions, which means that and the aim of the sanctions really were to cripple Russia's economy, cripple Russia at the heart of its economy. And what's the heart of Russia's economy? Gas, basically, oil and gas. Okay? But when Russia talks oil and gas, it talks about it not in the way Nigeria talks about it. It's one of the top 5 exporters of oil and also one of the top 5 exporters of gas. Okay? So when you talk about oil and gas, in a compounded manner, then you basically mean Russia. So, and it has built pipelines across European states, interestingly, some through Ukraine to Western Europe and then Eastern Europe. And if you follow the trajectory of the sanctions, you'd notice that the sanctions were aimed at Russia's economy. For instance, they tried to shut Russia out of the international financial system. They tried to shut Russia out of the international financial system through SWIFT, for instance, keeping Russia out of SWIFT. The US had said that it would stop importing Russia's oil. Well, one of the reasons why the US could say so is that the US gets less than 3% of its oil demand from Russia. And remember that the US is also a major producer of oil. But in the case of Western Europe, this was slightly different, over 40% of gas requirements coming from Russia. So if Western Europe had alternative sources of gas that could have been switched on day one of the sanctions, on the same day that the SWIFT sanctions were announced, on the same day that the dollar reserves of the Russian central bank were frozen, if Europe could guarantee alternative supplies of gas, they would have also switched off on Russian gas. So it was all about economic survival. And that's why in the initial days of the war, Russia kept supplying gas, Europe kept buying gas. So for both parties, they realized that we could keep fighting the war, the Georgia, but let's keep it outside of this gas, because Russia needs the money, Europe needs the gas. It's about energy security, because all of these alternative fuel options aren't mature enough to fill in that gap that Russian gas would fill in. So that was a preliminary why gas was left out at the beginning of the sanction rule books. Okay? So what's different today? Simple. What's different today is that Europe's conscience is being pricked. And it's now becoming a logical question to ask that you basically funding this war, because by keeping the gas pipes open with Russia, by buying Russian gas, you're basically funding this war. So on the other end, we're seeing the devastation of the war. Europe has not seen anything like this since the Second World War, and is raising ethical and moral questions. How do you keep sanctioning Russia as an aggressor? How do you keep funding Ukraine in arms and equipment and all of that? And you buying Russian gas. So it's that ethical, moral dilemma that has pushed Europe to this point. Now, on the other end as well, the US had long cut off Russian oil. The US had long announced at the beginning of its own sanction grid against Russia that we will no longer buy Russian oil, and had subtly been applying pressure on Europe to do the same. But Europe couldn't do the same because they were looking for alternative sources. Okay, so it's an economic question as much as a moral dilemma for Europe.
Yeah,
if I may add one more thing. If I may add one more thing. Now, remember, Russia had also been trying to flex its currency muscles and saying things like, since you've shut out the Russian central bank basically from its own reserves and can no longer access its own reserves. Now, what you need to do is that you need to buy Russian gas today in ruble. So that was really pushing Europe to some form of wall. And when you have your back to the wall, then it's easier to fight back.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. The issue of morality, indeed. And I do remember, when North Korea started developing nuclear weapons, there were sanctions imposed on the country, but there were certain areas that were not touched. For example, food supply and all of that to North Korea, because if they had stopped all of that, then the people of North Korea would have died. But once again, you have been researching on this. So how long, how long before, these European countries begin to feel the crunch, begin to feel the absence of Russian gas? Because right now they're still contemplating whether or not to pay in rubles. They're still insistent that this is a breach of contract. So how long before, they begin to realize there is no other way out of this?
Now we have to look at this in a multi-scenario manner. What has led to all of these conversations is the war, okay? Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that's the underlying issue here, really. So there are two ways of looking at this. One, you could chase the war itself. I'm not sure it would be wise for statesmen to abort the option of diplomacy, because what's the good old mantra about wars, that all wars end on a negotiation table. So that's still an option we mustn't take away. It's looking like a less remote option, a less remote in terms of probability of occurrence. It's looking like a less remote scenario today, but it's still possible and not impossible. So the first thing is this. It's looking like a war that will be long drawn. We hope it's not, for the sake of humanity. But it's looking like a war that will be long drawn. But this, I think, should create an incentive for peace efforts, for peace efforts in terms of statesmen coming together to say enough is enough. That's one. Now, on the second end, in terms of the ruble versus the dollar here, Russia is basically saying, you shut me out of the dollar system, right? And as long as I'm out of the dollar system, why are you paying me in dollars? Pay me in my currency, the rubles. Now, for Europe, it's a case of, if you pay in the ruble, then it just shows some form of desperation and then a moral paradox, in the sense that you've sanctioned Russia across many fronts, but you're going as far as buying gas in ruble. You've sanctioned Russia and crippled its dollar economy, but you're going as far as buying gas in rubble. But remember that what can bail Europe out today and what can basically make Europe say to Russia that keep your gas, keep your rubble, keep all you've got is alternative supplies. Okay? Is alternative supplies. Now, unlike oil, gas is a bit more, how do I put it now? Gas, it's not easily to just increase supplies because they are long-term contracts, okay? And if I may bring the narrative home a bit, this is where countries like Nigeria can now benefit. But like I said, these aren't short-term, these are long-term. Overall, on the long term, what Europe is thinking about today, the major thought on the mind of Europe is how do we diversify our gas supplies away from Russia? So what Europe is basically doing today is looking at the world map and saying, where are the alternative supplies of gas across the world? The Qataris, the Nigerians, and then the countries like Mozambique, where the Total project that was shut down due to insecurity becomes more important at this stage. Nigeria, for instance, the Train 7, which isn't due to come up for the next 2 or 3 years, the LNG Train 7, and even LNG Train 8, because remember that for a country like Nigeria, we weren't supposed to be talking of a Train 7 at this point. We should have probably reached even a Train 9 at this point. So bringing it home a bit, this is where we become once again very important in the energy markets to the Western countries. So we would see renewed interest in our gas, right? And it's another bailout for us as a country, especially thinking on the long term. So what this does is that at least it puts us on the world map in that energy conversation over the medium to long term. So the world is interested in how well we manage our LNG projects, especially an LNG Train 7, but more importantly, how well we can expand supplies. Because even after the war, Europe would no longer see Russia as a dependable ally, especially as Putin remains in power. So even when diplomatic efforts can yield the desired results, which is to end the war, okay? As long as Putin and that entire system he represents, as if Putin or anyone from that system he represents remains in power, Europe remains energy insecure and will continue to look for alternatives. And that's where countries like Nigeria and countries like Mozambique that are gas rich and have projects in the pipeline become increasingly important. So we must begin to talk about the Trans-Sahara pipelines and every other alternative that help us take supply across the world.
Orishejimi, thank you so much for speaking with us this morning. I couldn't thank you enough, for this analysis you've given on the oil situation in Europe and where Nigeria and other countries can come in. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much. Have a blessed day.
You too.